Failure to comply with such requests will be in violation of this code. Now, the system users on this network need to comply with network licensee in relation to data they may need to ensure that the system is operating efficiently. So as such, a chain is as strong as the weakest link. So we need all stakeholders to be involved and to ensure the efficiency of this system. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the plans, right? Right. So long-term planning. Now the long-term planning will deal with the energy and demand forecast, reduction in the losses of the transmission and distribution, the least cost expansion plan, IRP, and the objective of this IRP is to ensure that demand is met at the lowest possible cost. Now to mention again, consistent with Section 7 of the Act, the Commission will shall have responsibility to oversee and improve the process and outcomes of the integrated resource planning. And if you look at places like Barbados, they actually do integrated resource resiliency planning, so you see that we are coming in line. Now, I also want to mention here that we are trying to be ahead, we are pushing ahead. We're not trying to follow the Caribbean islands in light of development. Grenada is more than capable of leading the charge, right? I'm sure many of you in the room would agree with me. We also look at the risk assessment. And this is the assessment of the emergent threats and possible opportunities for an improved electricity system, as well as cost savings. Now, it should also be noted here that the development of the plans of expansion and the integration of renewable energy under the Act, Section 37 of the Act. Now, the network licensee is to develop this long-term plan, again, under the review by the Commission. So you have midterm planning as well. Now, in midterm planning, you would identify a suitable generation mix, grid improvements, and possible technical and economical implication of projects. Now, ultimately, for the near-term planning is not totally distinct. In this planning, we are ensuring that we have immediate elements in place as we need to operate consistently. Now you're going to dive over into the system planning process as well as with the interconnection, right? Because also that as you need long-term planning, midterm planning, midterm planning, you also have to consider interconnection and development of that process. That was what the doctor, sorry, Matthew was speaking about earlier, in terms of the generators. So for interconnection and system planning. Now, the interconnection applicants, they shall have a standard planning data and they will submit this data to the network licensee in a forecasted period of 5 years. Right? So now for the forecasted data, about the user's equipment. This is usually via the point of connection, right? So we move over into interconnection in relation to agreements. So interconnection with agreement, right? Now the network licensee will set for provisions in the interconnection agreement with system users. So here you look at the safety rules, the operations diagram, terms and conditions of service, the approval to connect, commissioning and periodic testing, as well as the submission of information and reports relating to compliance with the relevant interconnection conditions for that system user. Now with interconnection, there are factors to consider. Now, the network licensee, in consultation with the system user, shall determine the optimal interconnection method. Now, this shall not be limited to, but shall include the safety, maximum demand to be supplied, discrimination, geographical considerations, generating facility capacity. Now, I would like to touch here a bit on the discrimination. Now, once a system user has met the requirements to be interconnected, they will be connected. Now, these interconnected system users will also have data responsibilities to ensure the efficiency of the network licensing transmission and distribution system. Now, it's responsible for the system users to submit data as requested to the network licensee. Now, the data will be submitted electronically, consistent with the specifications established by the network licensee. Now, with any changes in data, the system user must notify the network licensee. And if the system user fails to supply data, the network licensee can report the failure to the Commission and shall estimate such data when necessary and feasible to do so. The network licensee shall advise the system user of the estimated data. Now, any system needs security. So with system security, this is to ensure the resiliency and reliability to ensure adequate protection of this network licensee system. So now system protection. When no network licensee circuit breaker is provided at the system user's interconnection point, the user must provide the network licensee with a means of tripping all the user circuit breakers necessary to facilitate any faults or system abnormalities. So you must be able to isolate these abnormalities and faults, right? The network licensee's standard operating procedures. Now, consistent with prudent and efficient practices, the apparatus and interconnection points should comply with the network licensee's standard operating procedures. Now, this will ensure that the procedures and apparatus will not cause a threat to personnel and the reliability of the system will be ensured. And the generator will keep a logbook. Now, this logbook is essentially to keep system test results and maintenance of records, right? And the network licensee's training policies. Now, the network licensee will ensure that operating, maintaining, testing, and the controlling of the transmission and distribution system, the operators of the system must have refresher training courses every 3 years, and they must continue to undergo this training process to ensure safety, reliability, and continuity of the system. And as such, they should issue certificates so that they can be checked and ensure that they are complying with this mandate. Thank you for your kind attention, and I welcome questions from the audience.
Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is now open to facilitate questions. You can just step up to the mic, and if you need any clarification, if you have any concerns that can contribute to the regulations, we will really appreciate that. Persons joining us on Zoom and the GIS and GBS Facebook page and YouTube channel, you can also send in your questions, queries, and comments.
I think my voice is low, but anyway, sorry. Now I'm listening to you, and I'm wondering, how do you plan to monitor and evaluate all the job program? So staffing, I guess you're working with work, project work. Now, how is PROG going to derive its income to help you out to always have to start over? I have to start over to that. He said, okay, how is PROG going to derive its income to be able to do the job effectively, it ensures that the consumers of Trinidad don't pay a large electricity bill if we are now going to use alternative energy. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question. So in order to aid the answer, I want to just show you or refer you back to one of the slides that I had up earlier in my presentation. Now, I mentioned something earlier about the non-fuel revenue requirement, right? The non-fuel revenue requirement basically is the translation of what the true cost that the utility included, well, in this case, the network licensee, is going to attract in order to provide the service that it is going to provide for the Iranian public, right? There are many components within there. You see something called O&M, that's the operation and maintenance cost. So you can get the non-fuel revenue requirement from that. Then there is a depreciation, so whatever asset that they have, so assuming they have a generator that has a depreciation life, depreciable life of a certain amount of years, on average is 25 years, that they can get over time in that component of the non-fuel, and you go along as you go along temporarily within that whole orientation, you can get an attributable cost at that given point in time. So that's within that depreciation. Accountants would know very well what that means. Then there's the taxes, license fees, and regulatory fees. So there is a regulatory fee that is levied against the existing public utilities. Now, that is one of the components, and that is a component fee that will be used for funding the Public Utilities Regulatory Commission. Then there is the contribution to social fund, and then there's the return on investment. What's going to happen here is that you're going to have that non-fuel revenue requirement is now going to be translated into your rates, which reflects on your non-fuel component on your bill. So you have a fuel charge, you have a non-fuel charge. A non-fuel charge is all of your charges that energy generated from the utility, when transferred to the consumer, they're going to contribute that component per kilowatt hour. So it can be, as you see on the bill, you have a non-fuel charge now for, I think it's 40.75 cents for residential persons, and then there are different values for the different customer classes. Now, one of the things that we realize here, so there is an assessment as mandated in legislation in the program, in which the PRC makes to the network licensee or any public utilities, and that is recovered in the non-fuel. Now the PERC is meant to ensure that the utility or the network licensee becomes more efficient as time goes on. So let's assume that they pay $1 million or $500,000 for the assessment, right? That's the regulatory fee. But the operations of the PERC might actually attract for the consumers a savings of $3 or $4 million, meaning that you're left with $2 or $3 million there, which is a resultant savings still, even though there was a contribution from the network licensee in order to contribute to the operations of the person who's going to hold your account and make sure that you become more efficient. The methodology that we have, the tariff methodology, is meant to ensure as a cap regulation mechanism. It shows as you go along, you should become more efficient. If they make a lot more savings, they get the excess. If not, then they need to absorb it, right? So I think I answered your question and much more.
Yeah. I have to sit on that. So come up with exactly what you're trying to refer to. Yeah.
Again, I thank you for being here. Can you briefly touch on any studies that have been done or will be done that will enable us to efficiently move from fossil towards the use of solar and wind energy.
Okay. So there are many guiding parameters. Mr. Andrews would have touched on the long-term planning, which is a integrated resource plan. So that's your long-term planning for what the generation mix can look like in Grenada. So we're looking at the assessment of all the generating sources. So where is your wind resource? Where is your solar resources? Where is your geothermal resources? What are your biomass resources? What are your different orientations of your resources for generating electricity? You also have, within that same study, you're looking at the energy efficiency mechanism, you're looking at the demand profile, meaning that as Grenada becomes more, it's looking at the GDP as it becomes more sustainable or more development occurs, we might end up with a 1% increase of consumption every year for the next 5 years or something. You project that and you see how your long-term generation mix that is guided by your policy orientation, meaning that you want to be sustainable, you want to be energy secure, and you want to be more affordable. So you're looking for cheaper and more sustainable resources for generating your electricity. I would also say that we have an engagement right now in which we are looking at some insulation studies, meaning solar insulation, looking at what is the true potential of all of the rooftops that are existing in Grenada, looking at where there are studies that were done by the utility also for wind potential. So there is a literature of different studies that will take place, but the IRP or the Integrated Resource Plan brings all of that together to basically collaborate it so that you can have a firm understanding of where your orientation for your generation mix is going to go.
Thank you.
Just a gentle reminder, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any comments or queries that were not clearly clarified here today, you can always send us an email at consultation@purc.gd. You can also call our office at 437-1602.
My question is there a formula which will determine what percentage or fraction of cost savings is transferred to the consumer, or the other way around? In the event of an Ivan or Emily causing massive destruction in infrastructure, how much of that extra expenditure are consumers expected to bear?
So a lot of the questions are outside of the scope of the presentation, but we are able to inform to answer. When it comes to an catastrophic event, in terms of a hurricane or something to that effect, currently there's an orientation which the utility is putting aside $2 million every single year. I'm sure you're aware of that. And that $2 million every year is put into a fund called a hurricane fund. And that hurricane fund is meant to reduce the capital expenditure needed for replacement of the transmission and distribution lines, right? The Commission, in looking at the tariff methodology that exists and what we're proposing, looking at the orientation that exists and what we're proposing, we are in line with a mechanism that is similar to that orientation, in which we have a full capital for a disaster fund, in which we are looking at putting the regulatory instruments in place, a regulation that is going to speak to what is the contribution that the utility or the network licensee and the other players in the market are going to put towards that fund. So in case you have a disaster or something taking place, hurricane, earthquake, to replace the lines, etc., there is some level of fund that will be able to assist with the upfront capital expenditure. Now, what that does is that it reduces that immediate capital expenditure or investment that is needed by the utility that's going to pass on to consumers, because you see the pathway starts with the depreciation, where you have your other capital contributions, etc. That goes into your non-fuel revenue requirement, right? And that is with our rate review, because we should review the rates every 5 years, but there's an annual adjustment of the rate. What is going to happen is that that is probably going to pass on to the consumer at a higher rate. But once we have some fund or something that will help to dissipate or to lower that actual cost. The first bit of your question was more or less how do you get a percentage, or how do you define the percentage that passes on? Quantifying the percentage is pretty straightforward in terms of at every point of a rate review. So the commission is mandated to set, we initiate, so we set and review the tariffs, right? There is a mechanism that we have in place. The initial part, we look at an interim tariff, a transitional phase, which we look at the status quo right now, and we evaluate the utility as it is, and we're going to get a point where we're going to say, this is what you should charge the consumers for non-fuel. This is what should be the guiding parameters for fuel. Fuel is a little bit more tricky, right? Then we also have the renewable charge where we want to introduce. So meaning that if there's low renewables cost, then that is transferred to consumers. When it comes to the component itself, the non-fuel element, basically, when you adjust, right, you adjust every single year that rate that I just mentioned to you, right? So you're non-fuel. So you adjust that every single year based on the economic conditions. There are other elements, so there's something called the NPI. So I think it's going to be a bit technical, right? I want to keep it as high level as possible. So there's an annual adjustment which is done to reflect what the rate should increase by or decrease by based on the operations of the utility. So that's enshrined within the methodology. There's something called X factor, which looks at the efficiency mechanism of the utility. There's something called Q factor, which looks at how much outages you have. So if there are too many outages, then they get penalized. If there are a minimal amount of outages, then they get a little bit of incentivization too, because they're doing very well, right? And then there is something called the Z factor, which relates to the hurricane and disaster aspects, in which if that occurs, then you have all of this. So this is a conversation around the tariff methodology, but the methodology is rigid and solid enough in which you can address all of these mechanisms. And I also want to highlight here that the renewable charge, which is a distinct cost for generating electricity, distinct to the fuel cost for generating electricity, should in the long term be lower. And with that renewable charge, we expect those savings to be passed on to consumers. As more persons install renewables, we have more IPPs, we have more self-generators, and we have a lower and stable, more stable rate of renewable injection. That rate is now passed on to the consumer. And the consumer can now pass that on, to the utility, the network licensee, and they can now pass that straight on to the consumer.
One moment, please. As you know, we are also going live on Zoom and on Facebook, so we have a question coming in from a virtual audience. After, we will take your question. So the question is, what is the role of the Ministry of Energy in the PURC arrangements?
So the PURC, the Public Utilities Regulatory Commission, falls directly within the ambit of the Public Utilities Ministry, right? We're mandated to regulate the electricity sector, and electricity is a component of energy, right? So by default, the energy spectrum has an influence on what the PURC does, right? Energy policy is the Ministry of Energy. So the Minister of Energy orients the policy of energy. So energy policy includes electricity. So electricity as a component of energy, natural gas, whatever other orientations around that. So when it comes to the arrangement, the Minister of Energy in view of the policy orientation from government, minister in cabinet, basically, and the Minister of Energy, basically have that overarching view of the policy orientation when it comes to the electricity sector. The PURC is mandated to ensure that we follow the public utilities and we make sure that the public utilities, which is the electricity company, which is a component of also energy, is regulated properly. So the synergy is within the policy orientation. The overarching policy for energy has an influence onto where the electricity policies themselves basically lie. Because the energy source, the sustainable energy, affordable, energy secure sort of generation of electricity, then you can have the electricity component because public utilities fall under the PRC and under the public utilities ministry.
Yes, good evening to members of the table and to everyone present here. More or less, the first question I wanted to ask, I think it was answered as Dr. Matthew continued his presentation. It was answered, but I hear all the time since government has repurchased majority shares from WRB, people seem to be concerned about the consistent sustainability of the supply of electricity. Given the present situation, because they are part of the conditions of some of the main generators at the plant that could start. So could you give us an idea as to, in an attempt to allay the fears of maybe members of the public, could you give us an update, or could you give us the assurance, assure that there will be no major interruption in the supply of electricity in the short term? Another question is that if, for example, another public utility company decides to enter the market and the concentration will be mainly on fossil fuel production, right? Energy via the same method as WRB used for a large extent. Would they be welcome? Because I know the transformation is going to be a process. It's going to be a working process. And as I understand it, and I hope I understand it and understood it right, that so members of the public who generate electricity via the renewables would be selling to the intention of Brennec, so that they would sell to Brennec the extra, whatever, and so on. So as I said, the other questions that I had were answered by the presentations. So that was my question.
Thank you for your question. Right? In relation to the power outage concern, power outage. Now, this is something that we have experienced power outages as time went by. I don't think it's something that will be new to us, or is new to us, or has never happened in the history of Grenada. But what I want to say here is that in the act or the code that we are speaking on is that there's a restoration policy whereby any outages will be communicated to system users, to customers, and so forth. There are things in place to hold the network licensing to high standards in terms of providing continuous power for consumption. And we know how important electricity is to us, right? I also like to go back to when I spoke about the reliability studies. This, as Dr. George pointed out, this will deal with the frequency and duration of outages. So if there is a decrease in the frequency and duration of outages, it's a plus to the network licenses. So there are things in place that would allow them to, or not allow them, but to say, that would drive them to ensure that power is always supplied in a reliable manner. good things. So I don't think it's something that we have to worry too much about, right? Now, where safety is concerned, sometimes you may need to remove the power. Like, for example, in a hurricane, we can have certain areas in terms of the power line will be hazardous. So the city has said that they will never experience power outage ever in Grenada anymore. I don't think the city can say that because there are reasons, particularly safety concerns, where power would have to be removed. I'm moving on to the aspect of the generation of different types of fossil fuels.
So, in terms of the fossil, we don't, the legislation and the regulations and the regulatory body, we will not, another fossil generated entity would not be allowed to be a major network licensee or player within the electricity sector in Grenada. If you read the legislation and you look at the act, and you compare that message becomes very clear, where we want to move away from fossil generation, right? Or we want to move away from dirty or diesel generating sources. If we have more affordable and more energy efficient, cleaner energy, then we can move to that. Natural gas is less emitted, much more affordable means of generating electricity, right? If it's going to have another fossil, it most likely can be an IPP who is going to be natural gas, but that is not the orientation that is looked at in terms of the generation for the electricity sector in Grenada. It's all about moving in a direction where we can harness our renewable resources and use those resources and pass on that reduced cost, more affordable, sustainable electricity to our Grenadians.
Another question coming in from our virtual audience, and then we'll take one from someone in the room. I must say that we are quite pleased with the turnout in the historical parish in St. Patrick, and we do welcome and value your contributions. So from our virtual audience, the question is, what consideration is being given to the storage of renewable energy due to the irregularity of wind and solar energy?
So that is a key component, and being very transparent here, if you read through the legislation is somewhat silent on the storage aspect. And that is something, and you'll understand that we're working, right? We're looking at where the new areas are, where the innovation is, where the sector is headed. So as an internal team, we're looking at the legislation, looking at it rigorously, interrogating it, and saying, well, energy storage must be a component there. And we have the viewpoint that energy storage must be a critical aspect when we look at, especially that larger injection of renewables within the system. So with all confidence, I can say that energy storage and storing renewables that is generated in the daytime, and then you have that in the stability overnight, it helps with even the stability, the efficiency of the grid, reliability. It's not just about the cost, there might be a higher upfront cost, but energy storage will be a critical aspect going forward, and we already started integrating that into the aspects of the regulations that we have here.
I think part of what was addressed a while ago was similar to my question, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you foresee a time when consumers will be able to generate their own solar power based on, like solar panels and stuff with storage and giving or somehow producing it and using and then selling to the community?
Right, thank you for that question. Now, in terms of solar energy, as you know, Grenada has a sustainability plan where we want to be 100% renewable by 2030. So we welcome solar, wind, and whatever other sources you may have. We have tidal, we have geothermal, and all these different sources of energy. With battery, I like to support and mirror what Dr. Matthew spoke on. Batteries is something that will help us in light of the sustainability, so we support that. And yeah.
So to add to this, there is currently you've been exposed to something from the utility called a renewable energy standard offer, right? In which they tell you can generate electricity from some solar panels, you can invest in solar panels, and then that energy you sell out to them, and then you're going to buy back everything that you want from them, right? At double the price. Now, what is being done within the legislation is that we're going to have a net meter orientation. So what I just spoke about was gross metering. Net metering means that you can generate all your electricity on your roof within your own premise for your own consumption within your own premises, and any excess that you have, then you can sell it to the utility. And I'm happy to say that last week, was it last week? This week, sorry. On Tuesday, this week, we basically started a consultation on what the self-generation program in Grenada would look like. And we have a pilot program which is going to have an aggregate amount of renewables that should be ascribed to within 1 year's time. And that is a pilot program which will be net metered. So every Grenadian, you're encouraged to contact the PRC if you're interested in generating electricity for your own use in your own premises, and we will give you the appropriate feedback in terms of your application, so you can be a part of that self-generator program, the initial pilot program that we're going to have, which will be reevaluated after 1 year or when the maximum amount of 1 megawatt is ascribed to, and then we're going to evaluate it and we're going to continue the program as we go ahead. So this is now being consulted upon, and this anticipated start date is the 12th of April, 2021.
And as we are talking about solar panels, the PUB is currently building its database on all solar panel installers in Grenada. So if you're watching, please contact us at 437-1602, and we'll have a conversation with you as it relates to the smooth operation of your solar panels.
Good evening to everyone. I would just like to know, for the sake of the average person on the street, what is the average reduction consumer should see going forward on the monthly bills? That's one question. I have another one. You want to answer the first one?
Sure. So we have done some analysis in terms of looking at what the status quo is right now, and we would have run the numbers. We have done some looking at the orientation of what is the fuel component charge right now, the mechanism behind the fuel charge. We also looked at the non-fuel operations and the non-fuel charge that the utility currently charge to consumers, right? Assess to consumers. And in our analysis, looking at all of the data from the last couple of years, if we were to change the mechanism, and just a simple aspect I'm referring to here, this will be done very soon. If we were to remove the possible profits that the utility or the network licensee can make on fuel, we can see at least a 5 to 10% drop in the cost of electricity to consumers. If we were to zero or make it fuel neutral, as they would refer to it. So we have a fuel neutral revenue, meaning that fuel, you should not have any profits on fuel. Because the cost that you pay for your fuel, so you pay $20 million for 100,000 or 2 million or 3 million barrels of fuel. When I charge my consumers that fuel charge, I see that I had $30 million in my revenue. That means I made $10 million on my fuel. What do I do with this? What the mechanism allows right now is that the utility can keep 90% of that, and they give the consumer 10%, right? So you had $10 million that you paid for, that the utility is going to keep 90% of it and give you 10, right? And what the regulatory new tariff mechanism is going to do is that we say that this should be fuel, this should be zero. Whatever you paid for the fuel, the charge of the charge to the consumer should reflect if you pay $20 million, you're going to get $20 million. And that's just one aspect. So when we look at that aspect, and we make the revenues fuel neutral, then we can actually drop the rates or the total bill for consumers in the short to medium term by at least 5 to 10%.
Okay, so let's just assume that someone's bill was $100. They would expect to either pay $95 or $90.
Yes.
With regards to outages, when your appliance get damaged, will there be a much more simpler process the customer has to go through to claim for the damages done? Because the former process was a very tedious one. So I would like to know what is the process going forward in order to claim for any damages done to your utility, to your appliances, sorry.
Sure. So Ms. Philip is also our consumer complaints officer, right? So that's going to be elaborated in a few minutes. But essentially, within the PRC, we know that that is a critical issue, right? And I would say that my answer to you probably is not going to appease you a lot much more, because the process might seem a little bit more tedious and elaborate, because first we have to go to the utility and basically ensure that we need to ensure that that is a substantiated complaint. So you can't just stand up on the edge and decide, well, this has spoiled, so you need to give evidence, right? And then we need to take that evidence. We need to make sure that you would have tried to seek the resolution with the utility, right? Now you can escalate that, so you don't have to go through an infinite loop there, right? You can escalate that to the PRC, and then once you escalate that to the PRC, then we would take it up with the utility, and we have the authority to make a decision based on the factual evidence that's presented on what the resolution should be. Right? We have a document called the Consumer Complaints Procedures. That document needs to be consulted upon just as we sit here. It's one of the documents in the pipeline. We have lots of regulatory instruments in the pipeline. So you're going to see a lot more of us, and you're going to hear a lot more about what we're doing. But the addressing the consumer aspect, in which we need to ensure that it is a substantiated complaint, and you would have made an effort to resolve that with the utility, and then you come to a third party. So now you have a third party assurance, so you can get a validation of their evidence versus your evidence, and then we can make a resolution on that basis. And it can result in compensation, or it can result in non-compensation.
But the fact remains that the company would be the first one who have evidence, knowing where the outage took place.
The company is obligated to supply, and that's written in the legislation, any information that the PRC asks for, they must supply to us in the factual detail and level as we require. If they don't do that, then there are penalties that can be expected. So they know that legislatively, we are given the authority to ensure that we have full coverage of any data, information, so we can get it at the real level, right? The green level in terms of when I'm talking about the data set itself. So we can be ascribed to that. We don't need to see a review document. We can get the actual data, and they report to us every single month. outages and all the other things. So we already have a capture of this.
Pleasant evening. My name is Jess. I'm a licensed electrician here for the past 30 years. While I have a great appreciation for that because we are trying to get the populace to invest in renewable energy. My question is, how are we going to assist in that regard? Because I would have known of situation where people would have invest, for example, in the solar panels, which comes at an exorbitant cost. So what would be the specifics in helping to ease the burden of investing in renewables? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Now, in relation to the solar panels, we are aware of the exorbitant price of solar panels, and as such, there are concessions where you can make a submission to the government to get concession on these funds, right? So I think that would alleviate the majority of the cost in that aspect and that regard, right? Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you, the head table, for the presentation and the enlightenment. This project seems to be very timely and in the direction we all like to see Greenland in terms of our public activities in terms of electricity and protecting consumers and lowering costs for the future. In this regard, I have two questions. One being somewhat aligned with, I think, the lady asked earlier, in terms of a bit more specifics and timelines. We're looking at moving to 0% eventually, which we know is not going to happen overnight. That will be a long-term goal. But I'm wondering, along terms, have we already set medium, short-term goals in terms of, let's say, okay, over the next 5 years, we can see Grenada moving from 95% down to 70%, and to accommodate that, we're looking at a spread of the mix, as mentioned earlier on, with 10% of that coming from rooftops that generate 1,000 rooftops that can generate 1 kilowatt per day output, type of specifics, so that we can have an understanding of the broad scale investment that is going to be required and what the balance of the mix is going to look like, so that persons who are interested in that can start prepping and say, okay, I want to make my investment in biomass, I'm going to make my investment in wind, I'm going to make my investment in solar and in the rooftop area. Is it that I can make a larger investment and do a solar farm that's going to produce XYZ amount as a bigger type electricity supplier, or invest in a large scale wind turbine? I think we'll just start with this question first.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So in terms of a long-term planning, right? So we have an overarching objective to reach the 5%, right? The national determined contribution, the NDC, right? And national adaptation plan. Now that is basically an overarching guidance on Grenada getting to 40% reduction in emissions from the 2010 values by 2030. Now that translates into a certain amount of installed renewables, right? And that value, based on the analysis that can be done, can translate into about 20 megawatts or something like that, right? Based on the emission factor, right? Different person can have different numbers. You can have 27, you can have 20. That is basically one of the overarching guiding parameters in that short, somewhat midterm, right? So at least about 20 megawatts of renewables. There's also the IRP that needs to be done, and that is critical, right? That integrated resource plan is a more in-depth analysis the overarching national economic contribution from your Paris Accord agreement with your CO2 emissions reduction, etc. That is an overarching view. When you do an integrated resource planning, because that overarching view not only does electricity, it also does transport, it does all of the sector, right, the NDCs. When you look at the electricity sector, you basically have the integrated resource plan, which is going to spell out what the generation mix will look like. So that integrated resource plan, which should be completed pretty soon, and once we get that regulatory instrument, generation expansion procurement regulation instrument promulgated, we have the legal authority to ask the network licensee to proceed to do the IRP. A study of such magnitude can take a couple months, about 6 or 10 months based on what they need to do stakeholder engagements. You need to have a good filter for like what are some of the planned projects. You have a lot of different factors within that. So I think that within the next couple of months, once an IRP is done, we would have a very good granular scale level understanding of how much of each generating source that we can really accommodate. Geothermal, solar at a certain level, wind at a certain level, and these will be a variety of guiding parameters. And then there's that year-on-year iteration, and then there's the 5-year iterations, which Mr. Andrews spoke about in terms of the long-term planning, as you look to have a greater capture of more renewable and more generating sources into the network.
Thank you. Looking forward to that towards that IRP. As you can see, things wouldn't go very far without that guiding, input. So the second part I had to again follow up from a previous question in terms of natural disasters, right? And my question here has to do with the possibility of inculcating insurance against the infrastructure, the supply infrastructure. And the question with that being, even though there's a fund that they can contribute to, that's over the long term. If we get hurricanes every year, if you make that initial investment, let's say 2 years into meeting our goals and objectives in terms of wind and solar and all of that, we make that type of investment and have a natural disaster pretty early in the game, it's going to be very difficult to recover that type of investment. That's one. Two, it means return to fossil fuel, which is going to give a big hike in the price again. And three, it means if you can't do that, it also means a longer term, a longer period of setback where the current renewable suppliers would not be able to produce for some extended period of time. So I would consider, is there any consideration given in the policy where insurance can also play a part, maybe not 100%, but play some role in helping mitigate against, in the event that there's some natural disaster or some other type of disaster that can lead to, the sudden, destruction of the system. Thank you.
And in response to your question, so there are 3 layers here, right? There is your homeowner who has a solar panel on his roof, who, the PRC might want to say, well, you must have an insurance coverage on that solar panel that you have on your roof, right? And there's the other person who we refer to as an independent power producer, and the PRC can say, you need to have, because we're going to inject 5 megawatts per year into the network, you need to ensure that if you can replace that asset via any given force majeure or act of God, right? And then you have the utility who already have insurance for the generating assets, and that's insured up to 1 kilometer past the generating set. So in Queenspark, so you have insurance up to the line is about 1 kilometer, I think it is, right? Past that, that is where the insurance or the hurricane fund is applied. So the transmission network, the transformers, all the way up into Soters, into Grenville, into St. John's, down into Point Selene, etc. You have, that's where the hurricane fund is meant to actually address. And because it's a very capital intensive outlay, the insurance rates for these things are very exorbitant. And that's the reason why the approach taken was to have set aside a bunch to self-insure over time. And obviously, within the guiding parameters of our regulations, it should be able to be resilient to two consecutive events or natural disasters within 2 consecutive years. That is the general thinking that the Commission has in terms of setting up that regulatory instrument for the hurricane disaster fund. I would say that we have not, in our original underpinning, think it was necessary to mandate the homeowner to put insurance coverage on the solar panel on the roof. Now, it's important to get your viewpoint on this because there are two aspects here. One of the things is that insurance cost is going to add to what exactly the outlay is for that system, right? One. And it can, in some places, inflate the cost. Now, there are counter arguments to that, right? Because if you have insurance on it, then your valuation of everything that you have in the house actually goes up. We thought it was necessary that we would compel you to say that you should consider insurance, but not tell you that you must put insurance. But for all the other players, that should, like the bigger players who are injected, they must have insurance if you're going to be an IPP, and if you're going to be one of the network licensee entities, they have insurance for the generating assets.
A question from a virtual audience. What finance mechanism is put in place to facilitate the layman and low-income persons to get involved as self-providers and as far as going as far as an IPP? What finance mechanism is put in place to facilitate or to help the layman or low-income persons to get involved to become self-providers or as going as far as IPP?
So one of the terminologies for this in the general global industries is an angel fund or something like that, right? So in other words, somebody belong will come and say, well, you look like you need some help, so I'm going to give you some money to start a business, right? Within the orientation of the PRC, I would say that the major considerations within that is that we're meant to stimulate competition in the market, right? Or competition for generation. We have not gone to that layer in terms of looking at having what you refer to as an angel fund or somewhere where we can stimulate persons to become IPPs, etc. We hope that persons have the I's dotted and the T's crossed in terms of looking out for what it is that they really want to do. I would also say on the flip side, we have social tariffs that are going to be within the mechanism so that persons who are vulnerable should be able to get a reduction in the rates that they pay for the electricity. And that is a policy orientation versus persons who are a little bit more well-to-do, right? That should not disadvantage anyone as we try to bring down the cost of electricity across the board. Now, the question that was posed was more on the investment side. So should the PRC fund someone to become an investor in the sector that we regulate? You tell me how that sounds.
I would like to remind our listeners and viewers that we are the independent regulator of the electricity sector. However, we have promised answers to your question. So here comes a question. Is the government of Grenada still focusing on exploiting offshore oil and gas?
That question is actually way out of our scope. We're a Public Utilities Regulatory Commission. We regulate the electricity sector. We don't have the reach to the energy realms.
Hopefully next time we might have a government representative who can help us answer that question. Another question from our virtual audience. How soon will the whole energy management system be in place so that an investor can confidently apply to generate as much as 10 megawatt solar energy? How soon will the whole energy management system be in place so that an investor can confidently apply to generate as much as 10 megawatt solar energy?
Sure. My interpretation for the terminology used in energy management system would probably be the procurement process that the FERC should endeavor in terms of getting new players in the market for electricity generation. That first I'll answer the question, in which we have a document, a regulatory instrument called Generation Expansion Procurement Regulation. That regulation spells out there the total life cycle of the procurement process, in which the PRC will do a request for proposal for new generation. We would encourage players who would come on bid for the new generating asset that they want to present. And the best, most sustainable price with the proper business case would be the value that wins the bid for the procurement regulation, the procurement aspect of the new generation. So we would, over time, and this is guided by the IRP also, which would tell us, the IRP would say that by 2030, we need 10 megawatts of energy from solar or wind. And the PERC would now endeavor to take on board its procurement process and say, we're going to have a procurement process for 5 megawatts in the next year, and then another 5 megawatts following on soon after that. But this regulatory instrument, and to be specifically answer the question, this regulatory instrument is going to be finalized within the next couple months. And then from there, once we have the IRP, we will have to put it to basically bring all of these procurement procedures into life so that we can have new generation from IPPs. In the meantime, we have the self-generator program, which is at the cost of being started. And that program means that persons who want to generate electricity for their own use in their own premise can already apply to the PRC, and we will be able to take on board your application and allow you, give you the legal authorization that you know go to the utility and the interconnect. We're also looking at small-scale IPP type systems in which we're going to do a selective tendering process because there are a lot of interest in that area. The large-scale 10 and 1 and 2 megawatt systems are a little bit they are better for the prices, and we know that because of economies of scale. But the smaller systems, we ensure, and we want to make sure, and we reiterated that part of the last working group session, that the local investors in Grenada, the persons who can ascribe to a 1 or 200 kilowatt system, will have the opportunity to be a player in the sector or the market that is going to help guide them in terms of the electricity supply. So that is a kind of provision, and that's laid out in the generation expansion document also. So this will all be on the short term.
I'm going to wear my environmental concern hat here, because there were certain terms that were mentioned early on and all through. You talked about the policy documents, and you talked about the Paris Agreement report, and you talked about the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of those documents that guide the policy that government of Grenada put into place for the sustainability of the electricity sector. And therefore, that created the act, stemming from right law. Yeah, that created those agreements that we signed that's supposed to, for instance, we're supposed to reduce our national utility contribution to emissions. And we have signed, tell me if I'm wrong, an agreement to do that. And therefore, the government of Grenada then had to invest in ensuring that happens. And we came back to the fact that Redlick was the company that was using fossil fuel to provide electricity, and therefore was creating major emissions into our environmental space. I'm going back to say that, I'll come back to you just. So, policy then was set up by the government of Grenada, policy document that went into a draft, a law to regulate electricity. And that policy guided the PERC itself. And so therefore, I'm thinking that PERC is the cart and the policy is the horse that will lead Grenada to reduce its emissions, and we can boldly say to the Paris Accord Agreement that we have, and to the Sustainable Development Goals, that I don't know which one it is, I know water is 6, I don't know which is for fair and electricity supply that is of renewable energy. Because renewable energy is what will force the emissions as far down as possible. So I don't know if through all of this I got it right. Torque is the cart, the policy is the horse. That will get us. Yeah, and that will discipline. That will get us to the position where we can safely, when we are speaking to the Paris Accord Agreement, that we have been able to do what we signed to do. That is so I'm happy about it, because a couple of years ago, we had a exhibition in plays called A Glimpse into a Climate Smart Future. And one of the outcomes of this exhibit, Climate Smart exhibit, was to ensure that we have a activity that will lower the carbon footprint. Because we were so bright that we knew that Redneck had a solar bank in place. So we said, okay, wonderful. Redneck, we're just going to take the power from the solar bank, put it on the grid, and then we will have our glimpse into a climate smart future where Grenadians will be able to see how it is that we could reduce our carbon footprint. Lo and behold, we were told by Redneck that can happen. And up to now, we couldn't understand why it is there's a solar bank is in a place collecting all this solar electricity that is not on the grid. So I'm happy to see that there will be some regulation that will ensure that we can provide our own electricity through solar, and that it could be used to reduce our emissions and reduce our carbon footprint. Because honestly, in a meeting on all of this, we had to accuse the Minister of Energy that he was going talking the talk and not walking the walk. So maybe you have to take back my words when I speak some word next time. So thank you. Just fill in the gaps where you think I went wrong and didn't have it all together from this afternoon's function. Thank you.
No problem. And in a couple short sentences, I would say that your assertion is correct in terms of the policy orientation, guys, what is going to happen. You have legislation that will give the legal clout to this, and then you have the regulatory body who's going to enforce this legislation that will have to enact all of these elements, and we have the regulations that basically bring them to the granular level, where we can say we provide an enabling environment for more competition in the generation and having more persons to generate the electricity for their own use. We look at we are a third party independent regulatory body that means to hold the existing utility accountable. We also need to make sure that the consumer's interests are in balance with this. We cannot say that the true cost needs to be passed on, but we want to ensure that that true cost is the real true cost, and if we can bring that to a better place. And yeah, so in summary, you have highlighted a lot of the key components there, and I would rather say that that is what we're doing, trying to ensure that all of these agreements that was ascribed to and the policy orientation that leads or guides what we're doing is exactly the orientation taken here in terms of the PRC.
Ladies and gentlemen, time is upon us, so we will facilitate one more question from our virtual audience. A reminder, you can always email us at consultation@purc.gd. Consultation@purc.gd. You can also call the office at 437-1602. 437-1602. A question from our audience. What measures are put in place for the disposal of parts of the RET, and in brackets there is the word retired, at the end of their lifespan? Would there be regulations addressing the type of equipment to be deployed on the island so that the standards of the systems can be maintained?
And I would say that that is one of the tasks that we have at hand. As we move to these orientations, so you have cradle to grave of these elements, so you have a PV panel or you have something that is being manufactured. There's something called a life cycle analysis of this thing. So you look at the whole full life cycle of these elements. You can basically have a good capture of what is the actual true benefit, right? So it's going to generate electricity for cheaper, affordable cost, or is it going to be much more detrimental to the environment? So all of these, like LCAs, are being, in some instances, they are already established. We know that solar panels can do very well in terms of helping in the long term. The batteries are a little bit on the iffy side in terms of the quality of batteries. So a lead acid battery is not a good option, right? Lithium ion, and we're looking at more efficient mechanism for battery storage would be one of the things that we have to work with. So we are mandated within the legislation also, Section 4 of the Electricity Act, to have environmental regulations. So that is related to the electricity sector, and that is going to be forthcoming. As you would basically acknowledge that we have a lot of different things that we need to address, and we need to take the critical ones first, although they're all critical, they did it yesterday, but we still need to start with one first before we get to the other. The environmental elements would be addressed also in regulation.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are so happy to see the turnout in historical St. Patrick's. We appreciate your comments and your queries, and we at the Pope, we are working together with all stakeholders to ensure that we have an electricity sector that is sustainable, it is reliable, and we have a fair and reasonable price for electricity. As you know, this process is an ongoing one. We have another consultation coming up, and I will issue an invitation now for you to attend. It is at the Anglican Pastoral Center in Guam, St. John, on Monday, March 8th. And we will be discussing the draft Grenada Electricity Sector Grid Code Supply Code. I hope that you have left your email address through which we can issue again another invitation to you. And we are again very, very grateful for your participation. On behalf of our CEO, Dr. George Matthew, our engineer, Mr. Crispin Andrews, thank you so much for coming. See you next time.